Good morning. My name is James Wu, and I was the 2018-2019 president of the Contra Costa County Bar Association and the former president of the Employment Law section in the late 2000s. On behalf of the Contra Costa County Bar Association, I would like to welcome you to the 26th annual MCLE Spectacular, and in particular, this morning's session, Disparate Impact of COVID-19 on the Workforce, Strategies for Avoiding Coronavirus Discrimination at Work, presented by the CCCBA Employment Law section. I know your morning is already off to a spectacular start with the fantastic criminal section and the litigation section programs. And this afternoon, after Novella Coleman's keynote, I am looking forward to visiting the section networking rooms, the sponsors' virtual booths, and learning some great tips at the live law firm marketing forum. At 4 p.m., there will be more MCLE programs. And finally, at 6 p.m., on our main stage, some entertainment. We want to bring a little fun your way this year with a bit of the bard, a bit of laughter, and of course, some magic. It will be lots of fun. Also, tomorrow, we have great half day planned and our keynote with Congressman Eric Swalwell. Our event and program sponsors are a very important part of our CCCBA community. They make it possible for us to provide events like this. Please support us by supporting them. At this time, I would like to pass the program over to our moderator, Marta Vanegas. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome. My name is Marta Vanegas. I'm a shareholder in an employment and business law firm, Martin and Vanegas, and represent and counsel clients on both sides of the employment aisle. I also serve as immediate past president of the employment law section of CCCBA. Our topic today is unsurprising but vital. The novel coronavirus has hit our Black and Brown communities hard. Jobs that interact with the public are more often held by minorities, which means that many people of color are forced to choose between earning a living or protecting their health and the health of their families. Employers who have cut staff to avoid the financial impact of the pandemic are often taking hurried action without careful analysis of how the job loss is distributed among protected classes. Our speakers will discuss these issues and provide practical guidance on avoiding workplace discrimination during these unprecedented times. Please allow me to introduce our speakers now. Anjuli Cargain practices employment and labor law with the San Francisco office of Duane Morris. She represents employers in all aspects of employment litigation, involving claims for wrongful termination, discrimination and harassment, and wage and hour violations. She also provides advice and counsel on personal policies and practices, employment and severance agreements, and a variety of other employment issues. Anjuli will be the president of the CCCBA Employment Law section next year. Paul Garrison established his own law firm focusing primarily on alternative dispute resolution. He is a highly qualified neutral evaluator, mediator, and arbitrator. He is an early neutral evaluator and mediator appointed by the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California, a mediator for the EEOC, and a certified arbitrator by the American Arbitration Association. He has already experienced early success in helping parties negotiate to settlement both multimillion-dollar commercial disputes and employment disputes. An active participant and leader in local, state, and national bar associations, Paul also enjoys running marathons, politics, reading nonfiction, wine tasting, and travel. And last but not least, Maggie Grover, an experienced mediator, workplace investigator, and discovery master. She practices with Grover Workplace Solutions in Oakland. She has practiced employment counseling and litigation for more than 30 years. Maggie is active in the CCCBA, serving on the Employment Law Section Board and as past chair of the ADR Section Board. In her free time, Maggie pretends to be an athlete, rowing the Oakland estuary and taking crazy bike rides. And now, I pass the floor to Paul Garrison. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here and be a part of this presentation today. I'd like to start off with talking a little bit about the question of kind of how did we get here? We're in a very unique and maybe unprecedented time where we're facing a pandemic with the COVID-19 virus, and we're also in the middle of a social justice movement that is affecting everyone, but particularly the Black and Brown communities. And it's important to try to understand when we talk about disparate impact, like how did we get here in the first place? And so I'd like to just start our discussion by focusing on a few of the historical markers of racial injustice in our American society. One of the most egregious and notable examples was the Tuskegee Experiment, which happened over decades here in America, where Black males were experimented on with respect to um, syphilis. Many thought that they were being treated for this disease, but actually they were not. And the purpose was to see what the effects would be on these individuals. They had no idea that they were part of this study. And when the greater society and these individuals learned about what was going on, it has reverberated still throughout the African American community and resulted in significant distrust of the healthcare system. Secondly, and there was an instance where an African American woman who was sick with cancer went to Johns Hopkins, a very well regarded healthcare institution, for treatment. Her cells were harvested without her consent or compensation. And her cells were used for studies in cancer that have led to some significant breakthroughs in fighting this terrible disease. And again, this was another example of how African Americans have been treated in our healthcare system. And then finally, I highlight an example of eugenics where African American women, but not just African Americans, these are also other individuals outside of the African American community have been impacted as well. But eugenics was a big movement, and perhaps still is in some respects. And it led to the involuntary sterilization of African American women and girls based on racial bias and myths and discrimination. These examples are just a few of the many examples that have led to the distrust of our healthcare system. And as a result, it has impacted how we respond in a pandemic. So let's talk about the results of the systemic racism in healthcare. As I've already stated, there's been significant distrust of the healthcare system in the Black and Brown communities. This distrust has led to the development of illnesses and conditions that are otherwise preventable. For example, hypertension is one, heart disease is another. And the list goes on and on because they do not go to get preventive checkups, and routine examinations to determine whether there might be an onset of a condition, because out of fear that some of the things that have happened in the past won't be repeated again and again. And so as a result, there's a reliance on more non-traditional, non-Western medicine with varying results, and sometimes nothing at all. In addition, in Black and Brown communities, there's a spread of hoaxes and myths about treatment and viable treatments for different conditions and illnesses. As a result of all of these things, there's been a reduced quality of life and reduced lifespan and early death in these communities. So let's talk a little bit about the factors that lead to increased vulnerability in the pandemic. Some of these were alluded to in the introductory remarks, and some of these are well known, and maybe some of them are less so in terms of being discussed in the discourse that is happening around the pandemic. One of the more notable factors is the frontline service jobs. Many individuals in the African American and Latinx community and others communities as well work in frontline service jobs. So the fast food restaurants, the transit jobs, things of that nature. Those types of jobs has placed Black and Brown communities in harm's way, as opposed to those individuals who may work in white collar jobs and in offices and where they can shelter in place at home. Another example is smaller and inadequate housing. It's well known that in Black and Brown communities, because of systemic racism, that there is a lack of adequate housing. One of the interesting examples is in the Latinx communities, particularly in California, where in agriculture, where there are fewer housing opportunities in those areas, and people live, quite a few people in one house, and for a variety of reasons. And so that makes them more susceptible to passing the virus from individual to individual when you can't sequester in one part of the house from the others. If you do come down with the virus and be able to quarantine yourself while you're trying to get better. So instead, if you're working a frontline service job, or maybe you're in agriculture, maybe your housing isn't up to speed, you can easily transmit the disease from one individual to another. In addition to that, reliance on mass and public transit to get to work can also present a problem. If you don't have a car and you can drive yourself where you need to go, and you have to take 3 buses to work or to the grocery store or whatever the case may be, it increases the likelihood that you will be exposed to the virus. And that is a significant issue in certain communities. Then again, once you get to work, or if you're being potentially exposed to the virus, do you have personal protective equipment, or PPE? Generally speaking, that is, while we've made some improvement and we've made strides, in some cases, it's still little to non-existent. And one of the interesting examples that came out early on I guess in the early days of the pandemic, there was an individual, an African-American man, who complained about the conditions at the Amazon fulfillment center in New York City. And he complained, and there amongst the workers there was a strike, and he was terminated. It's kind of an interesting situation, and you can read about it in the New York Times. But and he filed a complaint, and so I guess it's winding its way through the justice system. However, it does highlight what we're talking about here, that the systemic problems that are happening in Black and Brown communities are real, and so this leading to a few problems, to say the least. And then, of course, Black and Brown communities are generally in lower paid jobs, and jobs that do not provide healthcare benefits. And if you can't get access to healthcare, then you can't get tested, and you may have already contracted some pre-existing condition that makes you vulnerable to the disease to begin with. One of the things, and we'll talk about it later, is that one of the equalizers is that there's been a lot of the COVID testing stations that have been placed in the Black and Brown communities, that it's helped fight the virus, but more on that later. Then, of course, poor nutrition is a big factor in fighting the disease. And if you're don't have a healthy diet, then of course that hurts your overall health. And so that can be a problem in the fight against COVID-19. Another factor is the lack of education about protection against the virus. And we have seen this play out not only in Black and Brown communities, but everywhere, about the effectiveness of wearing a mask. I remember being on the street. I was walking maybe to the grocery store or somewhere, and someone walks up, an African-American gentleman walks up beside me, and he's on the cell phone and talking to someone else. And I heard him say, "Oh, I believe this is such a big hoax, and everybody's wasting their time talking about the mask." And this was in the early days. And so it just really made it real for me to hear someone say what had been reported in the community and in the media about the lack of education about how to protect oneself against the virus. We talked a little bit already about pre-existing conditions and the diabetes, the heart conditions, the hypertension. Those are some of the lethal conditions, or potentially lethal conditions, that plague the Black and Brown communities even before the pandemic. And as we've learned through the scientists, that if you have these pre-existing conditions, you are extremely vulnerable to the coronavirus, and it may lead to a severe bout of sickness and death. And in many cases, it has. And most of you already know about how many people have been impacted, and particularly the African American and Latinx communities. And the lack of access to healthcare, generally in Black and Brown communities, that is a problem. And even if there is healthcare that's reasonably accessible, again, some of those other issues that we've already talked about might prevent that individual from accessing the health care that is reasonably available, such as transportation and lack of education and information. So this is not an exhaustive list, but certainly it is a list of some of the key factors that lead to increased exposure and vulnerability to the COVID-19 virus. But it's not all bad news. There are hopeful steps that I think our society is taking and towards a fair and just society and workplace. For example, I mentioned earlier the access to the COVID-19 testing, and many stations are now being set up at churches and community centers and places in Black and Brown communities where access to testing is more readily available. And with that access, that means individuals can find out their status and take steps to quarantine themselves from others to the extent that that's possible, and to get to prevent the spread of the virus. Another step is the information is getting out, and it seems as if even now on a national level, there is some acceptance now of some of the same precautions that existed in the previous pandemic in 1918, which is socially distance and wash your hands frequently and wear a mask. And some of those things are being, not only that information is being spread throughout these communities, but it's also being more effectively implemented and embraced. Now we have a distribution of adequate PPE, and that's making a significant difference in protecting people from getting ill and saving lives. There's also been a proliferation of laws around protecting sick employees. So those who are not fortunate to maintain their health and get sick by the virus, there is protection. And we will be talking through some of the other speakers as well with respect to some of these laws. And there's been the development of sensitive human resources policies and procedures and practices that will lead to a fair and just workplace as people continue to work and return to work in larger numbers. And then I think it's important to have pragmatic diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, and many employers are adopting these types of policies that I think will lessen the adverse impact on Black and Brown communities. In some, poverty and racial discrimination has led to this adverse impact, but I believe that with some of the steps and perhaps others that I've just talked about, that we will have a more equitable and just society and workplace as people return to work amidst the pandemic and after the pandemic has been addressed and eradicated. So thank you very much. And now I'll pass the baton to the next speaker.
Thank you, Paul. And it was great that you ended up on such a positive note. So I'm going to take us down again. Every workplace, whether people are working from home remotely or actually going in, is experiencing an undue amount of stress, an unprecedented amount of stress. And for people in the Black and Brown communities, those stressors are multiplied. Health concerns that Paul mentioned, many are living with elderly family members, extended family members, so they're worried about passing the virus. They may have family members with those health concerns, so that fear of being infected is higher and may well be higher for members of the Black and Brown communities than it is for Caucasians. Finances, that choice that Marta mentioned at the beginning, going to work or staying safe, that's a real issue for people today. Working from home, having children in homeschool, providing family care, all of these are adding up to an almost intolerable situation. And so the employers are facing these events in the workplace that are really stress-driven. Employees who have been great workers for years are snapping and don't know why and don't know how to deal with it. So that's one of the things. And the other things that we can talk about are safety at work. If you are an employer, providing safety at work and assuring that your employees understand what you're doing is going to be helpful in reducing some of that stress. Now, California has required that before any workplace reopen, the employer needs to adopt a company policy. And that company policy has to talk about physical distance and barriers. What's the path of egress and ingress to the building, to the unique offices, to the common spaces like restrooms? How many people are going to be in a kitchen or a break room at a time? The company policy has to provide employee training. Employees are supposed to be trained before they come back into the workplace. Cleaning protocols. Who's cleaning the common areas? How often are they cleaned? What's being used? How employees are screened and how guests are screened. What are you doing for people that have to come inside? Are you having them answer questions, particularly in environments like healthcare and childcare, where there may be ultra sensitive people? What are you doing for infection control and unique industry requirements? The healthcare industry has unique requirements. Restaurants have unique requirements. Childcare has unique requirements. All of those unique requirements need to be built into your company policy. But I'm going to suggest that employee involvement in coming up with that company policy is going to help reduce some of those stressors. If someone feels like they are participating and have some role in deciding what the steps are going to be, if they can articulate what they want to have happen in order to feel safe, that's going to reduce some of the stress, because having more control over a situation, knowing what's going to happen rather than looking into the dark in fear, is helpful. I think empowering employees is also a real key to helping people in these frontline jobs that, as Paul mentioned, are far more often held by Black and Brown employees. And these jobs are usually not power jobs. They're not management, they're not leaders. They're dealing with the public. And they may be dealing with a public who feels entitled or feels in a rush or is stressed. And so one thing that I think you can do is to go through role play with employees so that you have them deal with a manager who is actually wearing a mask but is pretending not to, and have that conversation with the manager. How are they going to handle it when somebody comes up to where they're handing out the restaurant bags, or somebody comes up to the checkout line at the supermarket wearing a mask and saying, "It is my free will to not wear masks"? How are they going to be empowered to escort that person out or to step away from that person when they are yelling at them and spreading germs or potentially spreading germs? That role playing, that empowerment, letting employees know that you back them for taking steps that keep themselves safe and keep other people in the space safe. That's a key, I think, to workplace safety. Another key is letting employees design and lead training. It enforces for them their power in the situation. It lets them know that they are trusted to handle that power and lets them participate. Having an open line with the company for suggestions, as if you are the manager, you're not on the front line, well, maybe you take it for a while, but make sure that you revise your workplace policies with your employees' suggestions, because they're the ones dealing with the problems on a day-to-day basis. Have a plan for handling unsafe behavior, like someone who's aggravated, who's not wearing a mask, who's behaving erratically. Frontline workers often end up dealing with people who don't have homes and may be infected, may be dirty, and may not have had appropriate mental health care. So that's another area where frontline workers are faced with dealing with unsafe behavior. What are your plans for that? What are your plans for the not mask wearer? What are your plans for the entitled person who just wants to get in and wants to get out and is not going to show respect to your rules? And then finally, support at all levels. Do your employee training with the CEO, with the president, with senior management. Have the senior management say, these are our policies. This is our cleaning policy. This is our safety policy. This is what we are doing for you. And if anybody crosses the line and doesn't follow it, we're going to take action. We may ban customers. We may take other action. If an employee is not following it, we may suspend that employee. Make sure that management is providing support throughout your safety program. Now, something that Paul mentioned that is a benefit is a mandatory time off. There are both state and federal leaves. There are 80 hours of leave for full-time employees. There may be questions about ADA accommodation if somebody is not healthy after taking 80 hours. There may be sick leave, workers' comp if someone contracts the virus, and now there's a presumption under certain circumstances that if they are at work and they contract the virus, that it is contracted at work and becomes a workers' compensation system. There is special child care leave, and many local ordinances have been passed. Right now, the federal and state COVID-19 leave laws expire at the end of this year. But if the pandemic is still extending into 2021, I suspect that both of those leaves are going to be extended into 2021. I don't think I want to talk so much about what all of those leaves are, but your management needs to understand that those leaves are available. The 80 hours is paid time off. If it's a workers' comp leave, that is going to be paid through workers' comp, the same as any other sick leave. If they've got it accrued, is going to be paid time off. And so let your employees know that they have these protections if they contract the virus, or if there's somebody, if they have to be quarantined because they've been exposed to the virus. Let them know that this is not a choice of losing their job, losing their livelihood, or being sick, that there is some protection. Yeah, we are taking steps, masking, cleaning, social distancing, to do our best to make sure that you never come down with the virus. But if you do, you have protections too. And letting people know about those protections is something else that is going to be a stress reduction for them. Anjuli, I know your firm follows a lot of the laws. Have you heard whether there is likely to be an extension of either of the FFCRA or the state COVID leave into 2021?
No, I haven't heard any definitive statement on that. I would presume that as the pandemic, if the pandemic continues, and as we head into the new year, that it is likely that these leave laws, especially the local leave laws, will become extended.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement on that. So other time off. Under state and federal law, there's an accommodation of a disability. I think that in certain circumstances, fear of infection could rise to the level of a disability for which someone is entitled to have an accommodation. If the fear becomes to a level that they are unable to do their job, are unable to interact with other people, that level of fear probably would be a disability that would require an accommodation. I don't think COVID-19 fear has been defined in the diagnostic manual, but a disability is a physical or mental condition that impairs a major life function. And working in California is a major life function. So the fear of infection is something that the employer would at least have an obligation to engage in an interactive discussion and might have an obligation to provide some kind of leave for the duration or until the worker can get some kind of treatment and acknowledge that fear and move past it. Another situation that might be disability accommodation is a high-risk family member, because the Americans with Disabilities Act and the state disability protections apply when you are closely related to a person who has a disability. And so if you've got a parent living with you who has a history of lung cancer, or a child who has some kind of disease that puts them at a high risk, that's another thing. I think there are requests for disability accommodation in that circumstance. I don't know that that is mandated, but it's not a bad thing for an employer to consider, because a disability accommodation is unpaid leave. And particularly employers who don't need their full workforce might be doing well to put somebody on disability accommodation leave because they're concerned about infecting a high-risk family member. And again, Black and brown communities have a higher level of risk, and they have more often multi-generational housing situations. So more likely that those communities would be concerned about this high-risk family member. Other time off, part-time work. Again, you've got parents who are working and providing childcare because the childcare is closed. They're providing support for homeschooling, and they may just be too stressed out to work their full regular schedule. Accommodate by giving some kind of part-time work is a good situation, particularly again, for those employers who don't need all of their employees. Job sharing, part-time work, flexible schedules, all of those things can allow people to take time off to rest if that's all they need, take time off to homeschool, take time off to parent, take time off to provide care to their high-risk family members. But all of these things are particularly impactful in the minority communities. I think time off for testing, I personally think it should be paid. I don't think it has to be paid. But if you have frontline workers, people who interact with the public, people who are, as Paul mentioned, coming into work on public transit, where who knows what other people have been on that bus or that BART train, those kinds of things are fearful to them and fearful to me. I would really be grateful to my employer for letting me have time off to get a periodic COVID test. And then I would have some short term, obviously, feeling that I don't have it. And so I can go forward, particularly if somebody comes up with anything that looks like a COVID symptom, let them have the time off for testing. And the other thing is use temporary workers. There are a lot of people who are looking for jobs right now. If you have employees who need time off for one reason or another related to COVID, whether it's that high-risk family member, whether it's their own stress, let them take the time off, keep them on your list of employees. Let it be unpaid, let it be paid through the appropriate leave laws. If they can afford the time off, and hire a temporary worker, but you've got a trained employee who knows your business, knows your practices, knows your policies. Let them come back when it's safe for them and when they're comfortable doing so. I have seen a number of claims arising out of layoffs and furloughs where the company business dried up. They were a hotel, or they provided catering to conventions, or they provided gewgaws that were given away at conventions, or whatever else. Those things dried up and the company was panicked and let go 60% of its staff. Because it was panicked, it wasn't a planned reduction in force. Employers that plan reductions in force very often create grids and charts. And how old are these people that we are considering laying off? What is their race? What is their gender? What is their ethnicity? And they make sure that the mix for the layoff reflects the mix in the workplace as a whole to the maximum extent possible. That hasn't happened for people who were laid off at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't know if there are still employers, I suspect there are, who are going to go through another wave of layoffs. I know that I work a lot in the rental housing community, and that's not coming back. And so there may be another wave of layoff in that community. So there's still time to avoid bias if you are working with an employer who has not done a layoff and is considering it. Make sure that you are not disproportionately affecting the Black and brown workforce. Consider alternatives to layoffs like job sharing, half-time work. And then providing ample notice of return to work is going to benefit all of the people that you are inviting back to return. You're going to have people, if they've been furloughed, if they've been laid off temporarily, who have used that time and are providing homeschooling. They've lost their child care. They've lost, perhaps they're caring for an elderly parent. They've lost the support that they had around that. They may have taken another temporary job because they need to do something to keep food on the table. And this is particularly true in the minority communities. So you need to give them as much lead time as possible, not call them up and say, hey, it's 6 o'clock on Thursday. I want you back to work at 9 o'clock on Friday or 6 a.m. on Friday. Let them have that time to ramp up and reorganize their life, figure out where they're going to be, and do that for them. Remote work, if you've got remote work, many people in lower socioeconomic strata don't have the same setup that a manager would have. you have computer problems, they may need ergonomic support, they may need support with an internet provider. And if they're working remotely, consider their home situation. Do they have children? Do they have other family members? Adjust their expectations so that you can have realistic expectations. And be compassionate. Acknowledge the stress. Talk about it. We are seeing more biased words and behavior. There has been some effort generated hate speech. And certainly there are people that are reacting negatively to the Black Lives Matter movement, and that generates hate speech. Be aware of it and make sure it's stopped. Provide mentors from your management to your minority workers. If there's an employee assistance program, make sure that people groups. How are the parents who are dealing with trying to work and trying to manage homeschooling and trying to maybe still work 2 jobs or balance between 2 working parents? How are they handling that? Let people talk about it. As I mentioned before, role play the stressful situations, offer reduced and flex schedules, provide extended or additional breaks. 10 minutes may not be enough to unwind from dealing with angry shoppers. Thing that you might consider is on-site childcare, because childcare is today hard to provide. Paul, do you have any other suggestions that could be added to this list? Paul, you're muted.
Maggie, I think this is a pretty good list. I don't have something right now that I think that should be added, but if an employer were to do these things, I think it would be well on their way to eliminating some of that disparate impact that we talked about earlier. So I think it's a good list.
Great, thank you. And I will turn it over to Anjuli.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anjuli. Marta introduced me at the beginning of the presentation. And I am going to touch upon several of the factors that we've already discussed in the prior parts of the presentation, but maybe on a little bit more of a granular level. Can everyone see this slide that's in front of us? Great. So there have been several indicators showing that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on minority groups and protected classes. You heard Paul talk about that in quite a bit of detail. But the CDC has, and several other organizations have conducted studies, and I thought I would just share some of those statistics with you. So in the US, according to the CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, nearly 25% of employed Hispanic and Black or African Americans work in the service industry, compared with 16% of non-Hispanic white workers. Black or African Americans also account for 30% of licensed practical and licensed vocational nurses. As Paul mentioned, many people of color also depend on public transportation. These factors can result in exposure to the virus that causes COVID-19. So as you can see on this first slide, there are 3 organizations here: the CDC, which I just spoke about, the World Health Organization, and the Pew Research Center. So I just wanted to incorporate some excerpts from recent analysis supporting these points. We can go on to the next slide. So harassment and discrimination in the workplace. As Maggie discussed, there are a variety of ways that employers can help reduce harassment and discrimination in the workplace in general, but specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we get there, I wanted to touch upon the major protected classes. There are others, but these are the major protected classes that are impacted by COVID-19. The first one being national origin or race. The second one, age, meaning workers who are over age 40, and disability, disabled workers, which is broadly defined under the federal and state laws, as well as caregivers. And caregivers in and of themselves are not necessarily a protected class under federal or state law. However, it is an emerging group that has been very vocal about needs and concerns in the workplace during COVID-19. And Marta and Maggie shared what those concerns are, and those are well known these days about the necessity to care for elders or care for children or other loved ones while working during the day. So it goes without saying that employers need to pay special attention to changes in any of the workplace conditions due to COVID-19, and particularly how those changes impact protected classes. So this also includes rolling out new COVID-related workplace policies. So the EEOC, the federal agency, has provided guidance in the form of a publication called Pandemic Preparedness. And that guidance serves as a good starting point for employers to help implement strategies to navigate the impact of COVID-19 in the workplace. And there are also several resources that are available at the state level. But to just give you an idea of the types of issues that need to be considered are, number one, disability-related inquiries in medical exams. Confidentiality of medical information. Many employers who are reopening their businesses right now are grappling with how to conduct pre-screening or on-site screening of their employees and their visitors as well. So employers need to be careful about how the information that they retain is stored with the company. Hiring and onboarding, reasonable accommodations, pandemic-related harassment due to national origin, age, disability, race, caregivers and other protected characteristics, gender, male and female employees, and furloughs and layoffs, which Maggie touched upon, as well as returning to work and bringing your workforce back in a fair and equitable manner, such that protected classes are not treated any differently than other parts of the workforce. So how does an employer, what are the tools that an employer can use to address these scenarios? The best thing is to have a good policy in place. Many employers already have that in their handbooks, and that existed before COVID-19, but it's a good idea to revisit what are the employer's policies. Are they being implemented correctly? Are supervisors and managers being trained on these policies? And, you know, with the rollout of the COVID-19 policies, are all of those considerations in line with what is being told to employees during COVID-19 about how the organization will be operating? One tool that employers can use to make sure that their policies are in line to the extent possible is to conduct a discrimination analysis to avoid discrimination and disparate impact issues. So taking a look at the policy and maybe looking at or making some predictions as to how this will realistically impact the workforce. And at the end of that analysis, if the realistic impact seems to have lead to some sort of unequal treatment, well, maybe that policy needs to be reviewed with counsel again or adjusted in a way to be more equitable in implementation. Oftentimes, policies look equitable on their face, but may not be implemented in an equitable way. So this next slide just shows the variety of laws that are at play. We've got our state fair employment law, we've got the federal laws, the EEOC, age discrimination laws, federal disability protection laws, as well as COVID laws, like the FFCRA, which governs sick leave and caregiver leave for COVID-related circumstances. There's also there's a whole host of state and local ordinances that govern paid sick leave due to COVID-19. And then there are wage and hour laws like the FELSA, the federal law, and the California state wage and hour laws. That goes into my next slide, which is the implications of wage and hour laws during this COVID-19 pandemic, when the workforce is in flux, and particularly the non-exempt hourly workers have been most impacted by the changes in business closures and business reopenings and the remote work environment. So here are some issues that come up, which if they do, we would encourage employers to advise and consult with counsel on, is whether or not you can mandate leave for an exempt employee, and knowing what circumstances you can mandate that leave, saying, is this compliant with our paid time off policy? Is it a compliant leave and a protected leave under California law? It's good to revisit those issues when you are addressing any request for leave or need for leave expressed by one of your exempt employees. Dealing with employees who are under a government-imposed quarantine. The advice is generally to pay employees for that time when they are in quarantine, but that is an area of the law that's in flux. Employees who are unable to perform work from home. So that is an issue, and that is an issue that has affected minority workers more so than non-minority workers. And generally, if an employee is unable to perform their work, they're a non-exempt employee, an hourly worker, they're not paid for that time. And that's what the requirement is under the law. That obviously causes issues with the morale of non-exempt employees who are unable to work, not because of their own fault, but because the business is not operating. There's also the issue of covering additional costs that may incur for your remote workers, and dealing with internet accessibility issues, availability of laptops, and situating your workforce. A best practice is to make sure that your employees are in the best position possible to be able to perform work remotely, providing laptops if that's an option, and letting your workforce know that these resources are available. The next point is accommodation of differing work schedules. Maggie talked about this. I think that's an important kind of theme that is being echoed through this presentation, is compassion, and knowing that your workforce is dealing with differing situations, and having clear channels to report and convey those differing situations is going to help the conversations happen in a more productive way, so that if there is an issue, the employer knows about it, they can accommodate it, and the employee can move on with performing their work. So accommodation is just a huge issue in the pandemic workplace environment. The next point is I just wanted to touch upon, salary reductions during COVID-19 or during economic slowdowns. Employees do have to be paid their minimum wage, and it's important to keep in mind the federal and state laws with respect to minimum pay requirements and the guidelines and thresholds for exempt status and non-exempt status, and that could potentially be impacted if salaries are reduced. I'd like to go down to the next slide. So the next slide, we'll get to it in a moment, talks about COVID-19 litigation. And if anyone has been reading the legal news, it's no secret that there will be an uptick in all sorts of employment claims regarding COVID-19 situations. So I'm going to touch upon a few areas where we have seen there's been an uptick in litigation and where we think there will be an uptick in litigation as we head into 2021. So the first area is whistleblower complaints, and employees have a right to report unsafe work conditions due to COVID-19 under federal and state law. The federal laws provided by OSHA, and then the California state laws published by Cal OSHA set forth very detailed obligations that employers have to follow to make sure that their workplace is sanitary and that it's safe and in line with federal and state standards for safety during COVID-19. So if an employee does make a complaint, an employer cannot take adverse action against an employee for making such a complaint. It's a protected complaint. So it's important for employers to train their managers and supervisors on that right that an employee has, but also what it means to retaliate. That word is often thrown around, but it's not necessarily understood. So retaliation can be any form of adverse action, such as firing an employee, laying them off, demoting them, denying overtime, failing to promote them, reducing their pay or their hours, or engaging in some of the other activities that are protected by the whistleblower laws. So it's important for employers to regularly monitor and implement the requirements under the CDC, OSHA, Cal OSHA, and also be up to speed with regulations that may be governing their operations outside of California. And so how does an employer mitigate whistleblower retaliation type complaints? Well, the best thing to do is to provide the adequate training that I just discussed, but to also maintain anti-retaliation policies and other workplace safety policies like injury and illness prevention plans to apprise the workforce of what the requirements are and what to do in case a complaint is realized and reported. So the Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor has placed particular emphasis on whistleblower complaints during COVID-19, and they've issued some interesting publications and reports about this issue, and also just highlighting that there has been an increase. I think they said there were about 25 to 35% more whistleblower complaints that have been filed since COVID-19, so since March 2020. And that number is expected to increase as we go through the pandemic. And this is another best practice that it's good to mention because it's an overall best practice for any type of COVID-19 issues in the workplace is to establish a task force. So have a group of individuals, if your business is large enough, that, or one person, if the business is small, to be the person who becomes up to speed with the regulations and also is the contact person between management and employees for COVID issues. It could be a big role to fill, but it's a necessary one to have so that there are clear reporting standards, and that once reports come up from the workforce to management, they're addressed promptly and properly in accordance with the existing laws, but also the COVID-19 specific laws. It's also a good practice to, along with a prompt response to an employee, to conduct an investigation if it's warranted, and to document all of those efforts that are being done by the employer to look into the issue and address the issue if it's needed. So there, along with whistleblower complaints, there's also a rise in age discrimination suits, wrongful termination suits, suits being brought by caregivers, and race and gender and other types of discrimination and harassment suits that are being brought by members of protected classes. And this is going on all around the country. There is a large amount of the litigation is coming up in California, but it's really widespread across the nation. There are thousands of suits that are being filed and will likely continue to be filed. A good best practice, one that is likely known, but it's good to emphasize this, is in the case of any decision, any adverse decision that's being made with respect to an individual employee or a group of employees, is to do the equity and discrimination analysis before the adverse action is taken. It's important for employers to understand the risk of taking adverse action during COVID-19 and to make adjustments to mitigate any disparate impact that their decision might have or disparate treatment. An overarching principle is to be aware that if adverse action has to be taken, it has to be taken based on legitimate and non-discriminatory reasons. However, in the event that terminations are inevitable, and for some larger companies and even smaller companies too, furloughs and layoffs have just been a matter of necessity. It's important to have carefully drafted severance agreements and releases to make sure that potential claims are covered by those releases, particularly with age discrimination. Although a termination agreement may cover many different laws in the release, it also should cover a specific release, if applicable, if the workers are over age 40, to cover age discrimination claims. And there are special provisions of the ADEA that must be included in a release to properly and fully release age discrimination claims. Again, we'll touch upon caregivers and the importance of understanding that caregivers, although they may not be a protected class, they may, the caregivers may be able to allege their claims, under their protected status as a female or a gender or race, or in other ways, which may include their obligations to provide care to their elders or to their children. As schools start to reopen around the country, you can expect that their caregivers are going to be spread very thin and will be a sensitive population that will likely or they may likely develop claims based on their caregiver status. So I just want to kind of end on, what employers can do overall to mitigate lawsuits, particularly during COVID-19. It's important to pay particular attention to complaints that come up from your workforce and address those promptly. It goes without saying that having a clear complaint reporting policy that has easy to use, accessible channels for employees to communicate requests or issues with management is really, really important. And how the employer responds and when they respond is equally as important. So prompt, diligent responses is a good practice. Reviewing company policies with management and supervisors and talking to them about COVID-19 and what the requirements are under the COVID-19 laws is really, really important. Reiterating having compassion for the workforce is also and probably equally as important. Putting together a task force can be very helpful, and the earlier that task force is assembled, the longer they will have to get up to speed, which will be important to mitigate issues as they develop. And keeping good records is always a best practice. In the event that decisions are made or need to be made, they shouldn't be done in a hurried way to the extent possible, and counsel should be consulted with, especially because there is a known documented basis that there's going to be an uptake in litigation. A few other areas, pregnancy discrimination, PAGA, Cal OSHA claims, there's been an uptick in those as well. So that is, and that's my last slide. So I think we will conclude at this point and invite questions.
Thank you, Anjuli. I have just two small points to make. I've learned so much. This was excellent presentation from all of you. I had this nagging feeling that we are just scratching the surface at how to deal with a pandemic situation and what a time to live in as an employment lawyer. I would also counsel employers to watch for multiple minority statuses, either intersectional minorities or watch for competing minority needs. For example, if you need to accommodate somebody's allergies to disinfectants in the workplace while you are also accommodating somebody's need to have everything disinfected all the time because they are caring for somebody who is an elderly or otherwise a high-risk individual. And then Maggie's point was very interesting about fear of COVID maybe becoming a disability that's recognized by the courts. I have not heard of a decision that has recognized it. I would probably push that case to trial just to get that decision done one way or another. But I have had cases where the situation with the economy and the pandemic and the news and the entire thing just blew up pre-existing, perhaps latent disabilities. ADHDs got worse, depression, anxiety symptoms got worse, so much so that employees had to be taken to hospitals, and that would definitely trigger a need to accommodate a disability, even if the employer had no idea previously that such was the case. So thank you so much. And now, Teresa, it's you.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you also to Paul and Anjuli and Maggie for that very timely and very important presentation. I'd also like to thank the employment section for helping to coordinate this program. So you are all now invited to join us for a live Q&A with our presenters that will happen immediately following my announcements. Below the screen on which you're viewing the session is a link that's going to take you directly to the live Q&A. But before you do that, just a minute with me. I want to let you know our materials and evaluation forms for the program can be downloaded from this session page under the Files tab, which is near the chat. Completed evaluation forms can be sent to Ann Wolf. Attendance certificates will be available soon. If you are a CCCBA member, they're going to be in your member profile. If you're a non-member or you want more information on how to get your attendance certificate, check out the FAQ tab on the main screen. Coming up after this at 12:30 is our keynote session with Novella Coleman of Bay Area Legal Aid. She will be examining racial bias at the intersection of housing and policing. It's sure to be a very informative program. Later this afternoon, make sure to check out the section networking rooms, the sponsors virtual booths, and the law firm marketing forum. So I invite you now to click on the link below to join the live Q&A session with our presenters. I'll see you there. And that's it.